Hello, I'm Michael Wisner. I'm doing a series, a 10-part YouTube series on toxins and environmental health. And that's particularly important in the day and time that we live with this current COVID-19 virus and the pandemic it's causing. And because we know in science that toxins affect the immune system. And so what I've done is after spending 30 years in science as an environmental scientist and writer, I've learned a fairly complex subject and how to make that translatable in understandable terms. That's what I'm going to try to do for you. But these are going to be based upon science. Not only what we know in science that these chemicals and toxins can do to you, your immune system, your health, and your mind, but also simple things that you can do about them. So this is the introduction part to the series, and I'm going to cover some just general principles and ideas. So if you look at environmental toxins today, we're talking about low-level toxins, chemicals that you and I are exposed to every day in small amounts, none of which by themselves are going to hurt you particularly, in food and air and water. And we'll get into that over the course of the series. But we do know in science, these low-level chemicals that you and I, not working in a chemical plant or on a farm, we know that we're being exposed to them and it's doing things to us. For instance, the United States Environmental Protection Agency estimates that 2/3 of Americans are at increased risk of cancer just from their everyday toxic exposure. That's a big deal. It's a major source of disease and illness in this country. Michael Canyon of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says, and I quote, "The environment we have created may now be a major cause of death in the United States. Cancer, heart disease, and lung disease are just some of the problems." Since 1965, we have invented over 3 million new chemical compounds. 70% have never gone through adequate human safety testing. 100 years ago, 1 woman in 50 contracted breast cancer. Today, that number is closer to 1 in 7. That's its own mini pandemic. That increase in breast cancer has been scientifically studied and published by Johns Hopkins and the University of Mount Sinai School of Medicine in major medical journals. And those journals have linked that increase in breast cancer to the everyday toxins that we're going to be talking about. Those everyday toxins that this series will cover, from home and the water and the air and the food that we eat, those low-level toxins can contribute to, and science has shown, immune disorders, obesity, learning disorders, increases in leukemia, other forms of cancer, birth defects, sexual dysfunction, hormone imbalances, and those are all scientifically documented as coming from low levels of toxins. So this is an important subject. The immune system fights everything from the common cold to cancer. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has conducted a 40-year study, and what they've done is they've basically polled and surveyed the entire United States population. And they've determined that every one of us, that's you and me, have about 100 of these toxic chemicals in our body, lodged in our body. These are man-made chemicals, and most of the man-made chemicals we'll be talking about come from oil. There's nothing wrong with that. Oil is like the Lego building block of chemistry. We make nylon from it. We make plastics from it. We make dyes from it, pharmaceuticals. It's a rich source of hydrocarbons which help us make things. That said, when man-made chemicals are made from oil, some of them are designed, intentionally to persist. For instance, you don't want a dye that's going to fade or disintegrate. You don't want a pesticide that's going to break down in the field every other day. So you actually design these chemicals, and we can in chemistry, we can design them to resist breakdown or disintegration. The problem is, when these chemicals enter the human body, the body has no digestive tract that knows, or enzymes, that knows how to break these chemicals down. You don't have an enzyme in your stomach that breaks down like a long-term lasting pesticide. And so the body can't excrete these chemicals like it can our food waste and so forth. The chemicals go to the only oil-based tissue we have in the body, which is our fat tissue. When I say fat tissue, I'm not talking, it can be small, medium, or large. We all have fat tissue, okay? And that fat tissue is where these chemicals can go and build up. A best analogy I can give you is think of the clothes dryer, the lint trap you have in your clothes dryer, and it collects the lint, but it never gets cleaned out. That's sort of analogous to the human fat. And what the Environmental Protection Agency has studied is exactly that. The toxins build up over months and years. In science, we call this toxic bioaccumulation. One of the oldest principles in medicine is dose equals risk. The higher the internal dose, the higher the risk. As that internal dose goes up, so does our likelihood or prospects for disease or predisposition to disease. The United States Environmental Protection Agency survey found that all Americans have approximately 100 toxic, immune-suppressing, cancer-causing, hormone-disrupting chemicals stored in their body's fat. Adipose being the science term for fat. So that's you and me. As these toxic chemicals build up in the fat tissue, if they just stayed there sequestered in fat, we really wouldn't have concern. But we move fat from our fat tissue into our bloodstream every day. We do that when we miss a meal, when we diet, when we exercise, when we sleep at night. And when these chemicals move from the fat into the blood, that's what triglycerides and cholesterol are, little globules of blood, of fat floating around in the blood. Okay, when we move the fat from the tissue into the blood, we're now circulating those toxic chemicals in the fat in through the entire system of the body. So it's now, these chemicals are now exposed to the internal organs and most importantly to your immune system, your white blood cells that fight disease, from everything from the common cold to cancer. In this series, we're going to look at the major areas where your and my toxic chemical exposure comes from. Food, water, air, our home environment, certain drugs. And we're going to look at what the science says those toxic chemicals are actually doing to our health right now, what the science says. We're also going to look at simple things you can do to avoid them or remove these chemicals from your environment. But we're going to do these are simple things that you can do every day so you don't have to move on top of Mount Shasta, live in a bubble, and eat roots and tubers. And those things that we're going to talk about are simple things you can do are all going to be based upon actual scientific reports. I get a little bit somewhat nervous when I hear about all these various detox programs. I've been around this subject now, I said, for 30 years. And while I see a lot of programs, fasting and gut cleansing and liver cleansing and all, and by the way, if those help and it's done with a good nutritionist or doctor supervising and they help a person, I'm all for them. But what I can say is they don't address, and none of those programs address the most concerning area for me. And that are these very toxic chemicals that we've documented in science build up in your body and how to, in the fat tissue particularly, and how to get those out. Because until we do that, we're basically painting over rust. So that's a very important aspect of what I'm trying to cover on the series for you. And the final episode, the final part in the series will be on detoxification. And now this is a method that I was one of the scientific researchers that looked at and evaluated in now, I think, 12 peer-reviewed scientific journal reports. So we know this detoxification program that we'll get into is safe and effective, okay, and has been published scientifically. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about that as well. And that also will touch on, as the program itself does, how these chemicals and drugs can also affect not only our body and our immune system, but also ourselves mentally. So I look forward to it, and I'll see you at the first part of the series.